working at a global tech company with this scale that kind of spanned the globe, but having a team that I got to lead that also was international was rewarding, but not nearly as rewarding for me as coming back to my home state and doing something that was right in front of me and tangible. And I think when you go local, you get a lot more into a place where there's less polarization. You don't have time to worry about the politics. You're trying to just solve problems. And if we're going to rebuild our institutions in this country, I think you need that kind of local resurgence to get there. I just don't think it's going to happen at the national level. It's too rife with conflict.
Welcome to Anchor Change, where we help you panic responsibly in a chaotic world. I'm Katie Harbath. I've navigated impossible trade-offs in tech, politics, and my personal life for decades. I know that can be lonely. As a Midwesterner who spent 20 years in Silicon Valley and DC, it's taken me a while to figure it out. I still am. One thing that helps me is hearing the stories of other people forging their own paths. Because in a world of complexity, you don't have to navigate it alone. Welcome to Anchor Change. Hey, welcome to Anchor Change. I'm your host, Katie Harbath. I'm coming to you today from Eagle River, Wisconsin at Trees for Tomorrow. They are a fantastic organization that teaches kids about sustainability, about conservation. My dad has been a big part of this organization since his days running the paper mill in Green Bay. But I am up at my parents' cabin right now, and they are allowing me to use their conference room to do a couple of podcasts and other work-related things. So a huge thank you to them for letting me to do this. Because we have a very special interview to bring to you today. Steve Grove is somebody that I've known since he was at YouTube in the very early 2000s. He helped do the first YouTube debate in 2008. He helped do a bunch of news initiatives with Google. And then he went to go work for Governor Tim Walz of Minnesota, moving back to his home state, where he worked with one of the business commissions, and he was there during COVID. And now he is the CEO and publisher of the Star Tribune. And so he has a new book out this week, last week, when I'm sharing this, How I Found Myself in the Midwest by Steve Grove. I highly recommend that you check it out. And so I wanted to have Steve on the podcast to talk about his journey and his book. And so I hope you enjoy. Steve, welcome to Anchor Change.
Thanks, Katie. It's great to be here.
Yeah, it's so great to see you again. I was reliving some of our very early days of the internet with some of the parts of your book, because we both played a role in the early 2000s of tech and politics. And I wanted to start off by kind of asking you what you remember most about that time and what you think people get wrong when they kind of look back on it now.
Yeah. Well, I was kind of stumbled into technology myself. I didn't, grow up learning how to code or even really thinking about technology, but really discovered YouTube, like many of us did, as it kind of took off as this viral platform for clips being shared that were funny, dogs on skateboards and the like. But in those early days of YouTube, it was used in political matters that started to really change how we thought about journalism and citizens and voting. There was a moment in rural Virginia where a senator named George Allen was captured on camera, as you'll remember well, using a racial slur against his campaign's opponent. And that went viral, right? And it led to George Allen's loss of that Senate seat. The whole Senate shifted from right to left, and YouTube politics was sort of born. And so back in those days, it was a very empowering, almost utopian vision of what the internet could do. It was this kind of big balance shift in how people had access to information and the ability to connect. And I think, frankly, after several decades of massive trends towards inequality in our country, where wealth was concentrated in the top 20% and CEO pay, went through the roof and all these things, it felt like maybe the internet's the answer, right? And these tools and technologies that democratize the internet, use all these fancy terms like the meritocracy of YouTube and things like that were exciting. And so that was a really exciting time to be a part of the internet. I came on YouTube kind of employee number 85 or something like that to help them build a news and politics division for the first time. And we did all kinds of crazy things, debates where users would submit questions to CNN and snowmen would ask about climate change to presidential candidates. And, we interviewed the president 8 times in a row, President Obama in the White House with YouTube creators and others. And so it was a really exuberant time, but a lot's changed since then, as you know, and as you experienced at Facebook. And the book grapples with some of that and kind of the effects the internet has had, not just on politics, but on community in general.
And you got that job, is it right? You emailed info@youtube.com. This is before it was part of Google, right?
I'd emailed before it was part of Google, but I was hired just after. They have put a hiring freeze on as they were going through the acquisition talks. But yeah, no, it was early, and it was kind of a great time to be there because you had the backing of Google to make sure the servers could handle the load, but kind of the upstart pluckiness of a startup culture that remained there for a long time. And that was why we were able to do some crazy things where Google just kind of said, hey, YouTube kind of beat Google Video. It's off to the races. Let's let it keep growing. Yeah, it was the early days of the internet. Book it wasn't really much of a thing yet. MySpace was still kind of big. And these were, I'm dating myself a little bit here, but some of the
Yeah, we're
early
both
days
dating
of Web
ourselves, but
2.0. Yeah.
well, I think it's important for people to remember that because I think that we forget sometimes that these big behemoths were once startups in and of themselves, but
They
there's
were.
something about that culture of the startup that I think you bring into your book and sort of, moving back to Minnesota. What made you want to leave big tech to move back to your home state?
I loved working for Google as it was kind of a magical kingdom. There's literally a yellow brick road that runs through the campus. At least there used to be. But it did feel more and more different from the place I grew up. I grew up in Minnesota, a small town called Northfield, the son of a couple of entrepreneurs who started a small landscaping business in town. And I always loved Minnesota, but always wanted to leave. And never really thought I would come back. And I get into some of that in the story that I share in the book. But having a family made a difference. My wife and I had twins, and they were very little. And we thought, where do we want to live with them? The Valley started to feel like kind of a bubble. As much as Google's scale and YouTube's scale made a huge impact on the world, we were beginning to see that, in fact, all those utopian trends I mentioned before weren't, in fact, at the center of tech's future. There was a lot more challenge to it. And frankly, a lot of the companies that I thought might bring a correction to some of that might not be based in Silicon Valley. So we started looking outside the Valley, Mary and I, my wife, who also worked at Google, and chose Minnesota kind of for family reasons, but also as kind of an adventure. Like, let's just take a chapter in Minnesota and see what happens. We didn't quite know what would unfold. I was still with Google when we moved. But I also think that the Minnesota dynamic and the Midwest in general is just an underrated region of the country. People love to call it flyover country and what have you. But you have here in Minnesota a state that has consistently punched above its weight in almost every category of quality of life, incomes, the outdoors, sort of Fortune 500 concentration. So there's a lot to come to here as well. And we thought it was worth a bet.
Well, and there's a lot of, excuse me. Well, and there's a lot of in there. I like that you talk about the role of community and how many of because I know Mary works a lot with startups in the Midwest and you did too through a lot of the businesses you had, that I find this a lot on both coasts, whether you're in Silicon Valley or you're in DC, is you can lose sight of the people that you're actually impacting and building
Yeah.
for because you're working at such a scale and you're working with millions, billions of people that it's easy to lose the faces in that and the problems that you're trying to solve. Whereas you talk about in the book, not just I'm sure in the Midwest, but in many places, there's a lot of people who are building their own businesses, their own startups, who are really focused on a particular problem. And I kind of like that and was wondering if you could go into that a little bit more of like one of the realizations you had about the benefits of having that not necessarily smaller town culture, but that more local culture that you kind of got back in touch with what individuals needed.
Yeah. I think, when Trump won in 2016, just to put it in the context of the political moment that Google found itself in and YouTube did too, the company was really grappling with how did this happen? They had to commission surveys to understand the political mood. And I think that speaks a little bit to the Valley and a coastal elite bubble of where the country is at. In places like Minnesota, which have been purple states for a very long time, you don't have to commission a survey to understand what's happening in the community because you have people from all political persuasions all around you. And so I feel like there is a sense of, you get a better sense of the broad cross section of America when you leave some of these coastal hubs. I loved working in Silicon Valley. It's not that I think that coastal hubs are bad, but I do think when companies like Google and YouTube get to move at scale, and I'm sure you saw this at Facebook too, the decisions on what they choose to build change. You've got to kind of please an entire global audience with any given feature or tool or technology. It does shift what you decide to do. And I think that kind of the culture of the Valley, which has been so powerful and has been an engine for our economy, does come with it both a necessary element of swagger, but also kind of a downside of maybe too much swagger at times. And some of the technologies that get built there are really around kind of trying to grab your attention. Talk at length about big tech and some of its challenges, but I do feel like in the Midwest, there's a real problem-solving nature to the startup economy here. People here take on businesses that they really care about. Minnesota has one of the highest 5-year business survivability rates in the country. So people choose stuff they really want to do and stick with. One of the things I learned coming here is the medtech startup ecosystem here is the top of the country. I mean, Mayo Clinic, as this kind of global #1 hospital, plays a big role in that, but so does the University of Minnesota, Medtronic. And so I think that there's a kind of purpose-driven sensibility to the economy here in Minnesota and other Midwestern states that is good for the future of our economy if we can invest in it. Tech hubs outside the Valley can make a really big difference and I think shift some of the culture around tech that has gotten pretty toxic when we think about big tech and the downsides of it. I do think the solution to that is actually seeing more companies start outside of these coastal hubs.
Now, what was your job when you moved back to Minnesota to work for Governor Walz?
So I started when I moved back to Minnesota. At first, I was still with Google for, I don't know, maybe half a year. But then I got a job in the governor's cabinet after he won as the commissioner of the Department of Employment and Economic Development, or DEED, as we call it here in Minnesota. It's both the jobs commissioner, but also workforce development. So job training and then trying to attract companies to come to the state. And so it was really, as I signed up for it and was excited about it and honored to get to do it, a job about growth. But then a year into it, the pandemic hit. And so it ended up becoming a job about mitigating disaster, really. And then, of course, just months later, George Floyd was murdered and our city was in flames. And then it became a job as well about trying to rebuild some of those corridors that were hit. And so, you go into government and, you think you're going to experience one thing. And of course, events happen and you experience something else. But I found it tremendously purposeful. I speak about that a lot in the book. I think it's a model where more people, if they can, should try to leave private sector and go into the public sector, even just for a stint. I mean, that's, I think, kind of how our founders intended it, but I found a lot of purpose in it.
And I think there's a lot of people right now, right? There's a lot of layoffs in the tech sector. There's been a lot of layoffs on the federal sector. And there's a lot of opportunities still at the local level for many people to think about that. But also that had to be quite the whiplash of going from a place like Google, where you moved so fast, to government, where it's a bit more slower and deliberative. What did you learn in making that shift?
Well, it was a big shift, and I got a lot of advice going in from people. I certainly don't want to be that guy that said, the government should be run just like Google. But at the same time, I did find a lot of people in government who wanted to operate differently, who were excited about kind of a fresh pair of eyes coming in. We instituted things like OKRs at the department, Google's system for objectives and key results, how you measure progress and growth. We worked a lot on kind of creating an innovation lab and spaces within government where you could try new things and fail and not be afraid to give things a swing. And government often, on the first day of government orientation, I remember them showing me a picture of a fishbowl with a goldfish inside. And they said, "This is your new life. Like, everyone's watching, and don't say anything that you wouldn't want on the front page of the paper," kind of thing. Which is true, but it also creates kind of this culture where government officials feel, even if they have innovative ideas, it's really risky to try them. I think we need to shift that culture. And that helped coming from Google and trying to bring some of those insights into a bureaucracy. But I'd say maybe the biggest insight for me was just there are some incredible public servants that work inside government. And I think oftentimes government gets a bad rap. Certainly in the last 5 months, we've seen with Doge and what President Trump and Elon Musk have been doing, this kind of feeling that if institutions are losing trust, it must be because the people inside of them are the wrong people, or we need to kind of take a hammer to them or a sledgehammer to the bureaucracy. Certainly, there's more efficiencies to be had in government, but I would argue the more sustainable long-term path is to create innovation inside government. And you see that more at the local level than anywhere else. My book talks a lot about that, the power of going local. Working at a global tech company with this scale that kind of spanned the globe, but having a team that I got to lead that also was international was rewarding, but not nearly as rewarding for me as coming back to my home state and doing something that was right in front of me and tangible. And I think when you go local, you get a lot more into a place where there's less polarization. You don't have time to worry about the politics. You're trying to just solve problems. And if we're going to rebuild our institutions in this country, I think you need that kind of local resurgence to get there. I just don't think it's going to happen at the national level. It's too rife with conflict.
Yeah, I agree. But one of the challenges, though, that you talk about in the book that I'd love to also talk about is that also requires some tough prioritization, because you can't do everything that you necessarily want to do. And I think people deal with that at all different levels. How did that manifest itself in terms of you having all these different ideas or things you wanted to do?
Yeah.
And then how did you decide to prioritize what to do first?
It's always the hard part for any leader. And especially when you're a political appointee inside of government, your time is limited. And so there can be incentives to focus on things that you can control, within a short period of time, which is helpful. But I actually found that at a baseline, before even prioritizing, when I came into government, we wanted to focus first on the culture. Like, I wanted to create an agency. We had about 1,400 people that had the right kind of collaborative culture, that felt like there was space for growth and new ideas, and that had a set of values we could all adhere to. And that was the kind of the first priority. But then beyond that, how you prioritize things is a mixture of both where the lanes are, what kind of talent you have in the building, where you think you can take the organization, how far you can bend it without breaking it. You get a lot of help. I think if you just come in thinking that you have all the right ideas, you're going to hit some walls pretty quickly. So I think having this attitude of let's do it together was important for us. And then I think nothing stresses prioritization like a crisis. I mean, for my time in government, most of it was in the crisis of the pandemic. Every day, myself, Governor Walz, our health commissioner were on TV talking to the state about our pandemic mitigation and unemployment insurance payments. And, people have said this many times before, but, nothing like a crisis to galvanize an organization. And for us, that really helped the key priorities just raise right to the top. And we tried to take advantage of it to do some pretty big things. And I read about that in the book. It led to some pretty longer term changes that we were able to enact too on unemployment insurance and small business assistance. And that was really rewarding. But that's the hard stuff too. And you got to be kind of nimble in the moment when it hits.
Well, and you had to work a lot with Republicans too to get many of those things
Yeah.
out the door and do that. What did you learn in terms of working across the aisle and needing to work with in a bipartisan nature to help a lot of the small businesses you guys were working with?
Yeah. I mean, many of your listeners probably aren't from Minnesota or the Midwest, or maybe they are, but you might not know that Minnesota has, amongst most states, one of the more bipartisan political cultures out there. It often has split ticket voting. While a Republican hasn't won statewide office in some time, the legislature is always close, if not half Republican, half Democrat. And so there's this tradition and kind of a sense of responsibility in this state about working across the aisle. I don't mean to paint it as a kumbaya state, because we've certainly had our challenges, and as you've seen most recently, impact of political violence in our state with the assassination of our speaker, a moment we're all still reeling with that feels unspeakable. So every state has its paradoxes and its exceptionalisms. But I think, for me, working in government and across the aisle was essential. I learned that longer term solutions often come when they're bipartisan. The stuff that's quick and easy might not last as long if it's coming with just the majority of a democratically held body or a Republican one. I found that it was really rewarding. And I actually found that when you work in a political body that's more split, I don't know, there's better solutions come of it. I'm a pretty moderate person politically, obviously, a Democrat working for a Democratic governor, but some of the best stuff we did, like building startup programs to grow our state's innovation economy, or landing, changes to unemployment insurance law that helped young people have access to this for the first time, all had bipartisanship support. And I think it's something we need more of in this country, to be clear. And in local levels, it's easier to do.
Well, and I think too, I mean, Wisconsin's very much the same way too, where we're very split ticket, right? Like we've got Ron Johnson and Tammy
Yeah.
Baldwin in our Senate and stuff like that. And I think part of it too, and we've lost this a lot in Washington, is people from both parties, they hang out together, right? Like their families go to the same schools, they're going to events and stuff outside of the political system to kind of remind themselves of their humanity, I think, and the joint need of wanting to get stuff done for their communities. That is a much harder thing to do at the federal level when everyone's just flying back home to their own states.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, look, I don't think you poll most people, they would say, "Hey, I really enjoy a polarized political climate," or "Hey, I'm really a political firebrand." I mean, they're out there, but I don't think this is like a problem where most people don't want that kind of action in their political leaders. I think that they do. I think, getting back to our conversation on the internet and the state of modern politics, there are a lot of kind of contextual factors that make us feel more polarized, what travels farther online and what have you, and how people use the media cycle today. But at its core, this is a country that expects its leaders to work together and expects, collaboration across the aisle. And I think not just in the Midwest, but everywhere. And I found that to be true in government. And we need more of it. I think this is a country where you see trust in institutions falling across every spectrum, whether it's religion, government, the military, business, big tech, media as well. And that's not true in other countries, right? That is true here uniquely. And I don't think it's an inevitability, but if we're going to reverse those things, I make the argument in the book that you really have to start at the local level, because that's where you're going to have the tightest webs of trust early. And in this great tradition of America, where we try things out in these laboratories of democracy, that can have a national impact. But I think it has to start at the ground level.
Now, talking about difficult jobs, you've now chosen to go to the Star Tribune to be, is it CEO and publisher that
Yeah.
you are there? And so with traditional media in a very challenging spot right now, what drew you to that job?
I hadn't had newspaper publisher on my dance card or goal sheets, if you will. Especially coming from Google, I just always thought, man, that industry looks really hard, and I don't know if it can make it, just to be totally honest. But what seemed really intriguing to me about this job was that we had an owner and a board who wanted to reinvest in its future and who really believed that the Minnesota Star Tribune was an essential part of our democracy in the state. When they made the pitch to me that this might be a job worth considering, and they really wanted an outsider to come in, somebody who hadn't spent a career in publishing, I thought it was pretty compelling. I mean, one of the things you realize in government is you need a really strong media ecosystem to have a healthy society. And not to get all, statisticky on it, but it just is true across every metric of, civic participation, voter turnout, volunteerism, philanthropy, that when you have strong local news, those things go up. This has been proven. And the Strib, as we call it here in Minnesota, has long been a great news organization. It's 158 years old, but it really had atrophied on the digital front. So, I don't know, it just seemed like a puzzle worth unlocking, a challenge worth taking on. In some ways, the stakes are so high and the pressure is very real. And on the other hand, so many places are facing challenge. And it's like, why not us? Why not us to figure it out? Why not take a swing and see if we can turn it around? And that's what we're doing. We have a great new editor who just joined us, Kathleen Hennessy from the New York Times, and a really great leadership team and a phenomenal newsroom, but a lot of change we're going through. And that's, I'm enjoying that. It's a worthy challenge and a hard one, but I'd give us a shot here in Minnesota. We've got a lot of tailwinds along with our headwinds too.
What are some of the ways that you're trying to incorporate digital into what the Tribune's doing?
Yeah, well, just to give you a sense, I mean, our print publication subscription base goes down by about 20% year over year. And so that's pretty true everywhere. But when you think about that as the core business model for a long time, that's kind of the urgency that we face. And so it's not just like, hey, we should do a little bit better on digital. It's like we literally need to sprint towards being a modern digital media company while trying to prop up as much of the print stuff as we can. But if print kind of integrates across the culture, you just get weighed down. So we've tried to create kind of a print hub to make sure print has, an excellent future, but one that is drawn from a digital company rather than, I think in the past, you had a physical newspaper from which a digital report was curated, if you will. So that's kind of the big picture shift. We're focused on digital subscribers. We want to get to 250,000 in the next few years. That's a big goal. It will be challenging. We face this existential threat that I think people don't feel like they have to pay for the news anymore, which is the thing that every publisher faces right now. But we do need to grow a lot in digital subs. But we're also trying to create new revenue streams. We've opened up a philanthropic effort to be able to pull in donations. That's a really key piece of our effort. We're going more deeply into events and to sponsored content. We're going into sort of hyper-specific local spaces with high school sports. And so we're going to launch later this summer something called Strib Varsity, which is a really robust kind of prep sports product. I think for local news, we rebranded ourselves to the Minnesota Star Tribune last year, which is a big move for us to be a statewide publication. And speaking to that Minnesota identity and brand and kind of place-based journalism is powerful. And I still think kind of a squishy package of general local news is not kind of the bundle that a customer is kind of up for in today's media landscape, just to be clear. And so we are not only trying to do that from kind of a brand and aspirational standpoint, but really hyper-focused on the outdoors, high school sports, business, and some of these categories that are uniquely resonant with our audience base, where we want somebody to be able to subscribe to us just for those things because they see value in them, rather than having to feel like kind of this, I don't know, duty to subscribe to the whole package. Now, we want them to buy the full subscription, but if you don't target in this market, you're not going to win. And so that's a trick we're not trying to pull off, but it's a lot of things at once. And that's what's hard about keeping everything on the rails is you can't not do any of those things. And at the same time, it's a lot. So there's a bandwidth issue always.
How are you incorporating AI into all this? Because that's a huge discussion right now in the journalism industry, right? About use of AI in terms of writing, editing, summarizing, all of those different types of things.
Well, as much as we possibly can. I mean, any publisher today wears two hats. One of the hats is called regulation and licensing. And you're in DC working with legislators and the big tech companies to make sure how this model evolves ensures that people get paid for their content. If folks in the future can come to Google and just get the answer on the search results landing page and not go off to a publisher's site, that is a huge traffic shift for us, and we have to be aware of it. The other hat is called innovators, the innovators hat, right? And how do we use these tools to do new things? We have some grants we've pulled in from both Google and OpenAI to try some new things on that front. Some of them are just project-y, like we launched a culinary compass last week that is an AI-driven look at our kind of whole history of 150 years of recipes in Minnesota, and how do you help people navigate the precise one that works for them.
A lot of casseroles, I'm sure.
A lot of hot dish, as we call it here. But then there's deeper stuff that I think is more important, which is how do we create sort of a Minnesota guide for our state? If you're going to trust a Gen AI sort of assistant, if you will, that only is trained on Strib content, you might be getting better answers than if you're looking at the slop of the whole internet. And so those are some of the things we're experimenting with. We want to drive AI across our whole culture. We have to, as you know well, because you lived it and led within it. News organizations and so many for so long kind of ignored the social evolution in media, and to our detriment, I think. And we can't make that mistake again. And so with AI, we're trying to lean forward. But it's tough, hard to keep up when you don't have, we're not a tech company. So we don't have that same level of resourcing. We have to be very judicious about where we focus.
Another trend that publishers are facing are a lot of journalists deciding to go independent. They're using Substack or other newsletters in which to do that. We're seeing so many of them at the national level making that leap. How are you seeing that at the local level? Is it something that you're worried about in terms of talent?
Not yet, but of course we're following it. I mean, you've built this great following on Substack, one of many who have. Derek Thompson, of course, leaving the Atlantic last week, one of my favorite writers over there, was kind of a warning shot, I guess, again, of many to people that independent journalists can do well. And in some ways, I think it's really powerful. I don't think it's a trend that we should, shake a finger at by any stretch, but for legacy organizations, it's one to watch out for. I think to do really well, you have to have an audience that is a certain size. And so in the local level, we don't face that quite the same departure trend, but we certainly could. And so one of the things we've really leaned into is we've launched this platform called Strib Voices, which is kind of a reimagined opinion section where we're really elevating the individual journalists and columnists that we have and building brands around them. We want them to feel like, hey, if you're here and you're a person who has a voice and a public personality, we will treat you right. Like we will put you out in the market in a way that does lean into your strengths. And we've kind of tacked away from like the institutional editorial or the voice of God kind of pieces where you don't even sign it. It's like from the editorial board. Those are very few and far between for us now. We're really leaning into, I mean, this isn't rocket science, but the bylined piece and authorship and that kind of accountability. So we want to have the Strib be a place where if you want to build your own brand, you can do that within our ecosystem and benefit from being a part of the most trusted, news brand in our state. But that's a trick we're trying to pull off, and we watch these trends pretty closely, and we'll see if that works out. But we're bullish, and I think for local, maybe more bullish than most places might be.
So there's a through line through all of this for you in your career. I mean, one, I'd love to know how you sort of thought about these pivots and evaluating the risk with them, because it's not like you went into any of these jobs knowing exactly what they were going to be and what they were going to turn into. And I think a lot of people are in that spot right now of their own careers and kind of having to do some of these evaluations. You talk about it a lot in the book, but could you talk a little bit about what your thought process was in making each of these shifts?
Yeah, I mean, the subtitle of my book is called A Memoir of Reinvention. And I think everybody who's listening has had their moments of reinvention. I don't think I'm unique in that sense. But I have found it's kind of a superpower when you do. In shifting contexts, whether it's from Google to government or government to media, you bring fresh eyes to something just by the virtue of having been in a different sector and coming to a new one. And I think people underestimate that as a strength going into a place that feels new or different. Yes, taking a new job. Like when I joined government, I didn't know how to lead a federal government bureaucracy, a local government bureaucracy. Who would if they hadn't done it before? But bringing some lenses from Google were helpful in that process. Coming to a newspaper, but having been in government and tech. Again, I'd never led a news organization before. I had a lot to learn. I've learned a lot. I've made a ton of mistakes. But at the same time, having a fresh pair of eyes causes me to ask why more often than someone else might. And that's a superpower that I think people underestimate when they make shifts in their life. I guess what has guided me as best as I can determine it is just a lot of curiosity, because I think you have to be willing to learn and curious about the world and want to figure things out. And then, a belief that if we can get more people to band together around change, big things are possible. And we found that in government. I found that at the Strib so far. It's very much a we effort here. And the hard stuff's worth doing, and I think we need more people to shift contexts to change our institutions, because the status quo isn't working for a lot of folks. So I hope more people reinvent themselves and try new industries and new institutions to get in there and fix. I think it's a very American thing to do. It's not a new trend, but one that I've enjoyed and has had a fun time lifting up.
One of the things I appreciate you talk about in the book, though, is how hard it is of making friends when you're in your 40s, and later in life, and particularly coming home, because I find this too. I mean, you mentioned in the book, like most people who are still in Minnesota, these are friends they grew up with. Even if you lived there, you come back, you're still a transplant back into that world and finding those people. What was that experience like for you? And how did you go about trying to make some new friends?
There's a saying in Minnesota, if you want to make a friend, go to kindergarten here. It's kind of a laugh line. But it is somewhat true. 70% of the people that live here were born here. So it's a very sticky state. And that does lead to somewhat more calcified social structures, and it can be harder to break in. I wrote a whole chapter on this in the book. There are some ways the internet makes that possible through meetup groups and beyond. I tried some of those. Part of it is just being proactive. And for me, that meant recognizing that, hey, other people want the same thing as me. Like, people don't want to be lonely. They want to make friends. And so that gave me a little sense of taking a risk and maybe reaching out to somebody I didn't quite know and just saying, hey, you want to hang out? I think for men, it's harder. I don't know why, but it just is. I mean, I read a survey recently, and I think this is in the book actually, that 15% of American adult males say they have no close friends, which is really sad when you think about it. And half of the country will say in surveys post-pandemic that they don't feel like they have enough friends in their life. I mean, this epidemic of loneliness is something that far brighter social scientists have written about than I, but I think we all feel it. And I think the internet, while it has kind of opened up the world to people, has also given us this kind of cocoon ability. And I have found, and I think most people would resonate with this, that some of the richest parts of life have nothing to do with a screen. They have to do with in-person interaction. And it just takes a little bit of productivity and just a basic recognition that other people want the same thing as you, which is to have a community and to connect. And it's the most human thing ever. So it's not like we have any reason to have forgotten it, but I don't know, something about this moment and the tensions that feel inherent in sort of our broader culture have made it feel more elusive to folks. And I hope my book offers some experiences anyway that will counter that narrative, or at least give people a sense that, hey, actually, yeah, it's harder in your 40s and life feels busy, but you can't use busy as an excuse. You got to make time for it, because it's the stuff that when you're ending your life or looking back on the highlights of it, you're not going to think about, how many Instagram posts you curated, but you're going to think about how many people you knew and the connections you made. So I think that's been a big part of my journey coming back here.
Well, what struck me too, you said something about, I can't remember who said it, but like, it's hard to get them to move to Minnesota, but once they do, they don't want to leave.
Yeah.
Because as you mentioned, there's so many Fortune 500 companies that are in the Twin Cities that I think people don't realize. I mean, it's Target, you mentioned the Mayo Clinic.
Yeah.
General Mills, right, is another big one,
Yeah.
I think,
Yeah.
that's in Minnesota, yeah. And so it sounds like there were actually a lot of transplants, but you all needed to also find each other too.
Yeah. Yeah. You do. You do. And, this is the thing about Minnesota that's actually been proven through studies, is it's got the highest density of Fortune 500s per capita of any state in the country. And because of that, when people come, they suddenly realize, like, gosh, this place is invested in its infrastructure, its schools, its parks, its lakes, its bike paths, it's got world-class culture and restaurants and what have you. It's actually kind of worth staying. And managerially, if you come in as a professional to this culture, you mentioned some of the companies that are here, you may start there. But if you want to shift jobs, there's other really great companies in this market to go to. So you don't have to then move to Houston or Tallahassee or wherever it else might be. And so that's been a bit of the secret sauce of this state, is that kind of ability to move between really great opportunities. It's part of why I think for Mary and I, this felt like a risk, but not a crazy one, because there's just lots of interesting things happening here. So yeah, it's an investment that has happened over time. I mean, this is a state that has invested a lot in its infrastructure. It has had greater ties between sort of rural and urban Minnesota than most states have, through some of the ways that funding has worked. But also culturally, this is a state where a lot of people in the Twin Cities go up north to cabins every summer. And there's that kind of up north dynamic. I think you're in a cabin in Wisconsin
That's
right
where
now.
I am right now. Yep.
Yeah. So there's that culture. Minnesota State Fair is this amazing kind of, statewide block party where everyone comes together. So there's just these things here too, culturally, where Minnesotans have this sense of pride in this whole statewide identity that makes it feel, I think, a bit stickier too.
Yeah, there's someday that I want to do. I want to do like things for people from the coast to come to places like Minnesota and Wisconsin, and like we'll go to state fairs, we'll go to the dive bar, we're going to go to like the local parade. Like the 4th of July parade here in Eagle River is one of my favorite things to be a part of, because the entire community just comes together and nobody cares about the political affiliation or anything like that. It's just about having fun and seeing one another. And it's just such a breath of fresh air that you don't necessarily get in a bigger city.
It's special. Yeah. I think the smaller you get, the more intimate those gatherings feel. And people want to come together. That's neat. Now I have another thing on my list to visit, the Eagle River 4th of July parade.
Yes, you do. So what made you want to write the book?
Yeah. I guess like a lot of people, I thought throughout my life, boy, it'd be kind of fun to write a book someday, but I didn't really know about what. I think when I made this move to Minnesota, and especially moving into government and seeing the world through a different lens, and then the crisis that it with the pandemic made me think, gosh, maybe there's a story here. And I started writing a newsletter to friends on the coast and just shared about my journey and like, hey, this is what I'm going through and this is what I'm learning. And the feedback to that was really strong. And I thought, maybe there is a storyline here. Hard to write when you're in government. And so as soon as I left, I was like, let me put some thoughts together and see if there's something to it. And but happened to meet an amazing agent named Binky Urban in New York, who was willing to take a swing and shop it around a bit. And then found an editor at Simon & Schuster who was a Minnesotan, had grown up in St. Cloud. Her name is Stephanie Frerick. She's amazing. And so she kind of resonated with the story a bit. And, it took a long time to actually land it because I'm not a known author or proven author by any stretch. I think there was something to this story. And I think something to this moment, too, of the Midwest being on a national radar more often than in the past. Our governor just ran for vice president. Certainly, we've been in the news for reasons good and bad more than most places over the past 5 years. And so it just felt maybe resonant with a moment too, and was lucky to get to do it. So I hope it brings people some hope. I think it's a time of tension when we need some hope, and the book has a lot of hope in it.
It has a lot of hope in it. And it also has a vulnerability in it, which I also appreciate. Particularly, there was when you were talking about writing the book about the doubts you have about worrying about whether one story is worth telling. And that
Yeah.
really struck me at my moment of trying being like, do I want to keep editing this book that I'm writing? Like, is this even worth it? And I know a lot of other people too are sort of like, there's a risk in putting your story out there because you can be attacked for that. But there's also, I think, a huge benefit for people to be able to learn from what others are going through, realizing they're not alone, but realizing other paths that might be open to them as part of that. So how did you kind of work through some of that self-doubt?
Yeah, I mean, it's real. I'm 47 and I have a book with the word memoir on the title. Like, who do I think I am, right? Like, there's a certain sense of like, if you look at it cynically, you can be like, who's this guy? Is this guy like trying to run for higher office? Is this some play? I just kept telling myself, like, look, I think I have a good story to tell. I'm getting encouragement from family and friends. My wife, Mary, most of all, who's been is a central character in the book, of course, as she is in my life. This is in many ways our story, not just my story. We're just really supportive. I think the way we learn in life is we share things with each other. And while I started out with this book trying to write mostly about Minnesota and the cultural trends and shifts I was seeing and the professional experiences I had, it was the more personal components of the story that in many ways became the most powerful parts of it. One of the things you learn when you write, especially if you're writing about your own life, is if you don't open up and share the stuff that you struggled with or the challenges that you faced, why even do it in the first place? I mean, the whole point of writing a book or anything that you're sharing about your life is to help other people learn from it. So, I talk a lot about Mary and I having a fertility journey that had all kinds of ups and downs and challenges. And that is not something I ever set out to write about. But when I started to think about what are the things that have shaped me and that, frankly, I think other people might be able to benefit from hearing, components like that came to the fore. One of the things you learn as you write, too, is the process of writing itself generates insights and storylines that, you might not have put in an outline before you began, for example.
Yeah, it's been interesting. Just yesterday, I've been using ChatGPT where I'm trying to connect the dots of each chapter and I'll write some of my own thoughts. And then I have Chat AI help give me like prompting questions. And it's been helping me to connect. It's hard when it's your own life too, to sometimes take a step back. And I remember going to a friend being like, I don't know what's important, what's not important. Like I just read it and it's my life. Like help me sort this out in writing that.
It's helpful. Yeah, it's really helpful.
Yeah. It's super helpful. Was there anything like as writing this or like even as part of your own journey, stuff that you had to unlearn or let go of like what you thought your identity was and what it was becoming?
Well, I think that part of telling your own story is it's your shot to tell it and your shot to share your own background and how you became who you are. For me, one of the elements that came through in the book was my relationship with my parents and my religious background. I was raised in a pretty conservative evangelical family, and I talk a lot about faith in the book and my own journey to finding it. That was a very personal portion of the book that I think in some ways was hard to write, but with the help of my folks who were willing to let me tell the story of us coming together after years of having some religious differences was really powerful. So that helped me, I guess, in thinking about my own identity and what I felt like I could share with the world. You work in big tech and Google, YouTube, and places like that, and people might instantly think, "Oh, you're a gajillionaire who was born with a silver spoon in your mouth and what have you," right? And
went to an Ivy League school, did all that. Yeah.
Right. And I feel very fortunate. I would never claim that I haven't been born with a lot of privilege, but I did not grow up in any kind of privilege per se, other than being born a white male in America, which I would argue is probably being born on third base, regardless of your background. But I grew up in a Midwestern family with a small business, and we worked hard to make ends meet. And I felt like my family has been my biggest advantage. My parents were hugely supportive and helped me to get to where I am. But when you're in these big tech companies, there's a certain perception people might have of you that I think is fair to have, but may not be the whole story that someone brings to it, not the story that you would bring and others. And so getting to share a bit more about my own journey and the luck I've had, which is tremendous, but also the struggles. I hope just helps give a more complete picture. We all are complex people. People have layers. You go deeper and you find out a lot. And, book is kind of a unique chance to uncover your own layers. And getting to do that was really fun. So, I feel lucky to get to do it.
What advice would you give to somebody who's feeling pulled in a new direction, but might be scared to make that leap right now?
Yeah. Well, there's all kinds of factors people make when they're having life decision moments. I think oftentimes what's been helpful to me is a couple of factors. One is no decision is permanent. It can be easy to think that this one next decision is your entire life's future in one moment. And rarely is a decision like that ever fully the case. There's all kinds of twists and turns in life. So in some ways that lowers the pressure. Second, the kind of what's the worst that can happen dynamic has always been helpful for me. Like, okay, maybe I try this thing and it fails, but maybe I'll learn something from it. Or maybe there's something there that is powerful that I'll glean from it. But I think on the more positive side of it, outside of just sort of mitigating the risk, it's like, man, trying something new is incredibly invigorating. And the energy you get from it will carry you through moments you don't even know are there. Again, I think the superpower of moving from one space to another and bringing fresh eyes is a tremendous value that people kind of undercut. That you tend to kind of think, oh, well, I could never do that. I'm a novice, right? I wouldn't be able to, I couldn't compete at that level or do those things or be in that industry. But, places need fresh eyes all the time. And so if you're thinking about making a life change, your immediate superpower, if it's a significant one, are just your new pair of eyes that you bring to something. Every American has their moment of reinvention. Every person does. I found the bigger they get, the more rewarding they can be. And, you learn as you go. But it's always going to be tough when you shift from one thing to another. But the things in life most worth doing are tough. So I think that's important to lift up.
And where can people find you? You're going on a little bit of a book tour. But where can they find the book and follow your writing?
Yeah, well, stevegrove.com is my website, and there's a lot there to see. The book tour continues tonight. It's begun this week with Minnesota stops, and then we'll be in DC on July 23rd. We'll be in San Francisco on July 9th, and then a lot of greater Minnesota stops too. So we can share that in some links, but I'm excited to get out and talk about people about the book. And thanks for having me on today. This has been a really fun conversation.
I hope you enjoyed that interview with Steve. What strikes me the most of listening to it was we oftentimes can get so frustrated with what's happening at the federal level in the United States. And I think there's a lot at the local levels that we need to remember that are happening, that are giving us a lot of hope, a lot of people who are still wanting to work across the aisle, who are still wanting to make their communities better. And my hat's off to somebody like Steve, who is willing to leave a company like Google and go and work at the local level, because I think that is really important. And you'll hear a bit more of that next week in our interview with Jen Falco, who helped create Code for America and is doing a lot at the local levels too. So I really appreciate you all joining us. This was I wasn't planning on doing an episode here for July 3rd, but with Steve's book coming out, I thought it'd be a really important interview to get out there. If you enjoyed it, please make sure to like, to comment, to share it. And also don't forget that if you're interested in my thinking on a lot of this, you can subscribe to my newsletter at anchorchange.substack.com. Until next time.